Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another journey through the forgotten pages of history, where love flourishes even in the most inhospitable places and the most wounded hearts find healing. Today, we're going to travel to the vast territories of the American West, where a brave woman and a broken-hearted man will discover that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in the land, but in the bonds we create with one another. This is a story of new beginnings, of hope being born amidst snow and the cutting wind of the mountains, where each silent gesture carries the weight of an unspoken promise. Before we begin, tell me, from what city or country are you listening to us? Leave it in the comments. I love knowing where you come from. And if this story touches your heart as much as it touched mine in telling it, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that warm the soul. Montana, United States, late 1879. Wild territory near the Rocky Mountains. The wind whispered ancient secrets through the pines when Sarah Catherine Thompson first raised her eyes to the man who would change her destiny. It was a golden November afternoon when the aspen leaves trembled their last songs before the white silence of winter. She was kneeling by the stream, her hands submerged in the icy water that reflected Montana's infinite sky. The rounded belly beneath her navy blue wool dress betrayed the life growing within her, a secret she carried like a whispered prayer. She had fled Chicago with only a worn leather suitcase and the weight of shattered dreams, seeking a place where she could begin anew, far from judging gazes and words that wounded. The creak of saddles interrupted her contemplation. A tall man with broad shoulders molded by hard work dismounted from his bay horse a few meters away. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, observed her with a mixture of surprise and respectful concern. William Mackenzie had ridden these lands for years, knew every stone and every tree, but had never seen a woman alone building a home in this vastness. "Pardon me for disturbing you, ma'am." His voice was deep like the murmur of rocks in the river. "I'm Will Mackenzie, from the Double Creek Ranch. I didn't know someone had settled on these lands." Sarah rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Her chestnut hair, gathered in a loose bun, gleamed like bronze in the setting sun. There was a silent dignity in her gestures, a strength that time and adversity had forged into iron. "Sarah Thompson," she replied with a clear voice, though an almost imperceptible tremor betrayed her vulnerability. "I bought these lands from a man in Helena. I have the papers." Will's eyes swept over the half-built little cabin, the carefully stacked boards, the tools organized with military precision. It was work too meticulous for the delicate hands of a city lady, but there she was, building her refuge with iron determination. "Winter comes early in these parts," he murmured, noticing how she unconsciously protected her belly with one hand. "And it can be cruel to those who aren't prepared." Something in his tone, not condescension but genuine concern, made Sarah lower her guard slightly. It had been long since she'd heard a masculine voice that didn't carry threat or judgment. "I'm prepared," she said, lifting her chin. "I know how to take care of myself." Will nodded respectfully, but his experienced eyes caught details she might not perceive. The boards that wouldn't withstand December winds, the absence of sufficient provisions, the loneliness that emanated from her like wildflower perfume. "I'm sure you do," he agreed, placing his hat back on his head. "But if you need anything, our ranch is 8 miles north. Follow the stream to the fork, then take the white stone trail." Sarah watched him mount again, the fluid movements of someone born in the saddle. Something in her chest tightened, a strange sensation, like the echo of long-forgotten music. "Why?" she asked before he could ride away. "Why would you offer help to a stranger?" Will stopped his horse and looked at her for a long moment. In the silence, only the murmur of the stream and the whisper of wind in the leaves. "Because we all need a home, Mrs. Thompson, and we all deserve a chance to start over." He touched the brim of his hat in respectful salute and rode away, leaving only the echo of hooves on earth and Sarah with her heart beating in a way she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she didn't feel completely alone. 4 mornings later, Sarah awoke to the sound of approaching hooves again. Frost covered the world like crystal lace, and her breath formed delicate clouds in the sharp air. Through the cabin's small window, she saw Will Mackenzie dismounting, but this time he carried packages carefully tied to his saddle. She wrapped her wool shawl around her shoulders and went out to meet him, her bare feet finding the frozen ground with determination. There was too much pride in her soul to show any need, but curiosity shone in her eyes, like stars in the dark night. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." Will removed his hat, revealing dark hair where some silver threads were already beginning to sprout. My sister Rebecca returned from Helena yesterday. She brought some things that might be useful. He placed the packages on the rough table she had built with her own hands. When he unwrapped them, Sarah felt her chest tighten. Soft fabrics in ivory and baby blue tones, bottles of medicine, a book on baby care, and tears burned in her eyes when she saw the small hand-embroidered blanket. "I can't accept this," she whispered, though her fingers longed to touch the softness of those fabrics. "I have no way to pay." Will observed her with the patience of one who had learned that some wounds only reveal themselves gradually, like flowers that bloom in their own time. "It's not charity," he said with a gentle voice. "Rebecca insists on helping when she knows a new life is coming. It's a tradition of ours." Sarah sat heavily in the chair, her hands trembling not from cold, but from an emotion she had long tried to suppress. The words came out like whispered confession. "I was married, in Chicago. Theodore Thompson, a respected banker." Her voice broke slightly. "When he discovered about the baby, he said I had betrayed him, that the child couldn't be his." The silence that followed was not charged with judgment, but with a deep understanding that only comes from those who have also known pain. "He hurt me," Sarah continued, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. "On the last night I knew that if I stayed we would both die. So I took the money I had hidden over the years and fled." Will knelt before her, his grey eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in months. "You were brave," he said, and there was absolute certainty in his voice. "Protecting your child is the most noble thing a mother can do." "Technically, I'm still married," she admitted, shame covering her face. "I didn't have time or courage for divorce papers." Will nodded slowly, as if weighing his next words. "My wife Emma," he began, his voice becoming distant, "died 3 years ago. Typhoid fever. She was expecting our first child." His fists clenched involuntarily. "For weeks I kept wondering why God would allow 2 such pure lives to be taken." Sarah extended her hand without thinking, lightly touching the back of his hand. The contact was brief, but carried the weight of 2 souls who knew the bitter taste of loss. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "You don't need to carry the past like a stone in your chest," Will said, standing. "Sometimes God gives us a second chance when we least expect it." He walked to the door, stopping only to turn one last time. "Winter's going to come hard this year. The trees are telling me. If you change your mind about the help." Sarah watched him leave once more, but this time there was something different in the air. When she touched the soft fabrics he had left, she felt for the first time in months that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had thought. A week passed like the gentle flow of the stream, and Sarah had grown accustomed to the distant sound of Will's cattle grazing on the nearby hills. It was a comforting sound, whispering of protection and stability in a world that had offered her little of either. When Will appeared again, this time with tools tied to his horse and wood cut to precise sizes, Sarah didn't protest. Perhaps it was how the mountain cold had grown sharper each day, or perhaps it was something deeper, a silent acceptance that some battles didn't need to be fought alone. "The walls need to be reinforced," he said, examining her work with respectful eyes. "You built well, but December wind can topple even the strongest oak." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, Sarah's hands holding the boards, while Will nailed them with military precision. There was a strange dance in their movements. She anticipated his needs, passing him nails before he asked, he adjusting his rhythm to hers when the baby's weight made her rest. "Rebecca told me about the rumors in town," Will said during a break, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve. "Seems there are tensions with some Crow tribes that were displaced by the railroad's arrival. Nothing serious yet, but it's better to be prepared." Sarah stopped organizing the tools, her eyes meeting his. "Prepared how?" Will walked to his saddlebags and withdrew a rifle, the polished metal gleaming under the autumn sun. "Do you know how to shoot?" "My father taught me when I was a girl," she admitted, "but it's been years." He spent the rest of the afternoon teaching her again, his large hands covering hers as he showed her the correct position, his warm breath against her ear as he explained how to aim. Sarah tried to ignore how her heart accelerated with the proximity, concentrating on the safety the weapon represented. When the sun began to set, painting the sky pink and gold, they sat on the cabin steps to watch the spectacle. Sarah had prepared coffee in an old kettle, and the aroma mixed with the smell of pines and damp earth. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, her hands wrapping around the warm cup. "Helping me, I mean." Will remained silent for a long moment, his eyes lost on the horizon where the mountains met the sky. "When Emma died, I thought my world had ended," he began, his voice low and measured. "For months I just existed. I would wake up, tend the cattle, sleep, repeat. My brother James said I had become a ghost of myself." Sarah waited, recognizing the weight of the words to come. "Then one day I found an orphaned calf in the snow. It was nearly dead, abandoned by its mother. Something in me couldn't just pass by." Will smiled slightly. "I took it home, spent nights awake feeding it, warming it, and while I cared for it, I realized there was still life in me." He turned to her, and Sarah saw in his eyes a vulnerability he rarely showed. Sometimes, caring for someone who needs it teaches us that we too deserve to be cared for. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. For the first time in months, they were tears of gratitude. "And the calf?" she asked. Will laughed, a rich sound that warmed her heart. "It became the most stubborn bull in the herd. James swears it knows I saved its life, and that's why it refuses to obey any of my orders." They laughed together, the sound echoing through the mountains like a promise that joy was still possible, even after so much pain. Autumn slid into winter like a long, melancholic sigh, carrying away the last golden leaves and bringing the sharp scent of approaching snow. Sarah had grown accustomed to Will's visits, sometimes to bring provisions, other times just to check if she was well, always with the silent respect that had become the mark of their growing friendship. It was on a December afternoon, when the first flakes began to dance in the air, that Margaret Whitmore appeared on Sarah's property like a storm dressed in silk. Sarah saw her through the window first, an elegant woman mounted on a white mare, her impeccable emerald green dress contrasting with the rustic scenery. There was something in her posture, in the way she observed the cabin with calculating eyes, that made Sarah instinctively straighten her shoulders. "Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret's voice carried the authority of one who had never been questioned. "I'm Margaret Whitmore. My father owns the Whitmore copper mine." Sarah went out to greet her, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her belly was even more voluminous now, and she noticed how Margaret's eyes fixed on it, with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "How can I help you, Miss Whitmore?" "Actually, I came as a concerned neighbor," Margaret said, dismounting with practiced grace. "There are rumors circulating in Copper Falls about you, and about William Mackenzie." Sarah felt her blood freeze in her veins, but kept her expression neutral. "Rumors?" Margaret smiled, but there was steel behind the courtesy. "A married woman, pregnant, living alone on the frontier, and receiving frequent visits from a respected single man. You can imagine how that sounds to decent people." "My personal circumstances are not the town's business," Sarah replied, her voice firm despite the internal tremor. "Ah, but they are, my dear." Margaret took a few steps toward the cabin, her eyes evaluating every detail. "You see, William and I have an understanding. Our parents always expected us to marry, and now that he finally seems to be recovering from the loss of his wife." Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Of course, a man like Will, handsome, prosperous, respected, would have suitors. And Margaret Whitmore, with her polished beauty and family connections, was exactly the type of woman society would expect him to choose. "I don't know what understanding you imagine having with Mr. Mackenzie," Sarah said carefully, "but I can assure you our interactions have been perfectly respectable." Margaret laughed, a sound that cut through the air like broken glass. "Oh, I'm sure they have. But perceptions matter as much as reality, don't you think? And the perception is that a woman of dubious reputation is corrupting a good man." "I suggest you leave," Sarah said, her patience finally exhausted. "Of course I will," Margaret agreed, remounting her mare. "But first, let me offer some friendly advice. These lands, are you sure the papers are in order? Because it would be terrible if you discovered you were living illegally on federal property." Sarah's heart stopped for a moment. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing specific," Margaret smiled with false sweetness. "Just that my father has influences, and it would be a shame if an investigation were opened about the legitimacy of your land claim." Sarah watched Margaret ride away, leaving only the echo of hooves and a sense of dread that spread through her chest like ink in water. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt that perhaps there wasn't enough escape in the entire world. December arrived with the ferocity of a wounded animal, bringing blizzards that transformed the world into a white and silent carpet. Sarah had spent restless days since Margaret's visit, repeatedly checking her property papers, looking for flaws she hadn't noticed before. It was during one of those anxious nights of vigil that Will appeared at the door, shaking snow from his coat, his face marked by worry he couldn't hide. "Sarah," he said, removing his gloves with abrupt movements. "We need to talk." She let him in, preparing coffee in silence while he warmed himself by the small wood stove. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension, like the air before a storm. "I went to the registry office in Helena today," Will began, accepting the warm cup, "to verify your property papers." Sarah's stomach plummeted. "And? The man who sold you these lands was an imposter." Will's voice was gentle but firm. "These lands belong to the federal government. They haven't been officially opened for claim yet." Sarah sat heavily, her hands trembling as she gripped the table. "So Margaret was right. I'm here illegally." "Not necessarily." Will leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The Homestead Act allows any American citizen to claim up to 160 acres of public land. You just need—" He paused, weighing his words. "You need to prove you're a citizen of good moral standing." Sarah laughed bitterly. A married woman fleeing from her husband, pregnant and living alone, not exactly what they call good moral standing. "Unless—" Will stopped, swallowing hard. "Unless you weren't alone." The silence that followed was charged with implications neither dared to verbalize. "Will," Sarah began. "I know how this sounds," he said quickly. "But think, if you were a widow, or a married woman with a respected man from the community." "Are you suggesting we get married?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will stood abruptly, walking to the window where he watched the falling snow. "My brother James came to see me yesterday," he said. "He's furious about the situation, says I'm staining the family reputation, that Emma would be ashamed." Sarah felt as if she had been slapped. "So that's it? You're giving in to the pressures?" Will turned to her and there was deep pain in his eyes. "No," he said firmly. "I'm choosing you, choosing the baby, choosing this chance to have a family again. But Margaret Whitmore, can want whatever she wants." Will's voice carried iron determination. "I never promised her anything. Our understanding exists only in her imagination and in our parents' hopes." Sarah looked at her own hands, the weight of the decision pressing her shoulders like a heavy blanket. "What if this is a mistake? What if you regret it?" Will knelt before her again, taking her hands with infinite gentleness. "Sarah, in these last months, you've brought something back to my life that I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, purpose. The possibility that love doesn't need to die with those we love." Tears rolled silently down her face. "You don't really know me. You don't know all my secrets, my flaws." "Then we have time to learn," he said simply. "If you want to." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin, in the silence charged with possibilities, Sarah finally nodded. January arrived with the force of a hammer, bringing a blizzard that seemed determined to erase the world from existence. Sarah had awakened that morning with a strange pain in her lower belly, a tightening that came and went like ocean waves. Will had arrived 2 days before, when the first dark clouds began to form on the horizon, and now he was trapped with her by nature's fury. The cabin, which had once seemed small, had become a refuge against the white chaos that roared outside. "Is the pain coming more frequently?" Will asked, watching her lean over the table, breathing deeply. Sarah nodded, one hand resting on her voluminous belly, the other gripping the table's edge. "It's still early," she murmured. "It's still too early." Will knelt before her, his grey eyes calm despite the storm of worry that surely raged within him. "Babies have their own schedule," he said gently. Emma always said they come when they're ready to face the world." The mention of Emma should have hurt, but instead, Sarah felt a strange consolation, as if Will's first wife were there, guiding them through this night. Another contraction doubled her over, stronger this time, and Sarah groaned involuntarily. Will rose quickly, his hands finding her shoulders. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the obvious uncertainty. "Hot water," Sarah said between breaths, and the clean sheets Rebecca brought." The following hours blended into a blur of pain and effort. Will moved through the cabin like a dedicated ghost, anticipating every need, offering comfort with soft words and constant presence. When the pain became unbearable, he held her hands, letting her dig her nails into his skin. "I can't do this," Sarah gasped during a particularly intense contraction. "I can't, it's too early." "You can," Will said, brushing the sweaty hair from her face. "You're the strongest person I know. This baby is coming because she knows you'll be an extraordinary mother." It was in the early hours of morning, when the storm finally began to calm, that the first delicate cry cut through the air. Will, who had become an improvised midwife guided only by instinct and necessity, lifted a small, perfect little creature. "A girl," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It's a girl." Sarah extended her trembling arms, and when Will placed the child against her chest, she felt as if the entire world had reorganized around this moment. The girl was tiny but vibrant, her lungs protesting vigorously against the cold. "Hope," Sarah murmured, tears flowing freely. "Her name is Hope." Will watched mother and daughter with an expression of absolute reverence, like a man who had witnessed a miracle. "Hope Elizabeth," he agreed. If you'll permit me, I'd like to give her my surname as well." Sarah looked at him through her tears, seeing not just the man who had become her safe harbor, but the father this child deserved to have. "Hope Elizabeth Mackenzie," she said, testing the name. "It sounds beautiful." Outside, the storm had given way to crystalline silence. Snow covered everything with immaculate purity, as if the world had been washed clean for this new life that had arrived. And in the small, warm cabin, an unlikely family found their first moments of perfect peace. The spring of 1880 arrived in Montana like a fulfilled promise, melting the snow into singing streams and painting the hills tender green. Hope had grown strong in Sarah's arms, a cheerful child who filled the cabin with her musical laughter and life with new purpose. Sarah sat on the porch steps Will had built, watching Hope try to catch the butterflies dancing among the wildflowers. The girl had her mother's dark eyes, but already showed signs of both parents' determined temperament. "The papers arrived from Helena," Will announced, approaching with an official envelope in his hands, his smile illuminating his entire face. Sarah stood quickly, her heart accelerating. "And the lands are officially yours," he said, handing her the documents. "Sarah Catherine Mackenzie, legal owner of 160 acres under the Homestead Act." She looked at the papers, seeing her new name printed in official letters. Sarah Catherine Mackenzie. 3 months had passed since the simple wedding at the Copper Falls Registry Office, officiated by the traveling judge in a ceremony that was more practical than romantic, but had sealed something much deeper than convenience. "There's more," Will said, his eyes shining with excitement. "Do you remember that section of the stream where you always washed clothes? The one where the water forms deeper pools?" "Yes. We found gold. Not much, but enough to guarantee our financial security. Rebecca says with this discovery, we can live comfortably without depending only on cattle." Sarah looked around, seeing her property with new eyes. What had begun as a desperate refuge had become a true home. The cabin had been expanded, with an additional room for Hope and improvements that made it warm and welcoming. "Will," she said softly, "can I ask you something? Anything? Do you regret it? Giving up your share of the ranch for me? For us?" Will knelt beside her, taking Hope in his arms when the girl came crawling toward them. "Sarah, look at her," he said, kissing Hope's forehead. "Look at what we've built. How could I regret the best decision I've ever made?" Hope gurgled happily, her tiny hands grabbing Will's beard, and Sarah felt her heart overflow. In recent months, she had watched Will transform from a man marked by loss into a devoted father. He changed diapers with the same competence he handled wild horses, sang lullabies with a deep voice that made Hope fall asleep instantly. "James came to see me yesterday," Will said, his expression becoming more serious. Sarah tensed, preparing for bad news. He apologized, said he was wrong about you, about us. His wife Martha is expecting their first child, and James said he now understands what it means to protect your family at any cost. And Margaret?" Will smiled ironically. "Margaret married a cattle trader from Helena last month. Apparently she decided a man with Eastern connections would be more suitable for her ambitions." They laughed together, the sound echoing across the property like music. Sarah looked at the horizon, where the mountains met the sky in shades of violet and pink, and for the first time in her adult life, felt true peace. "I wrote to my sister Catherine in Chicago," she said. "I told her about you, about Hope, about our new life. She replied that she wants to come visit us in the summer. It will be wonderful to meet her," Will said, and Sarah knew he meant it. That night, as they watched Hope sleep in her handmade crib, Sarah and Will sat side by side on the porch, listening to the sounds of the property settling for the night. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Sarah murmured, "that all this is real." Will took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "It's real," he said. "And it's ours." In the sky the first stars began to appear, silent witnesses to a family that had found their way to each other through the storm and had emerged stronger than they had ever imagined possible. May brought gentle rains that awakened the earth from its winter sleep, and with them, a letter that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. The envelope arrived through the merchant who passed monthly through the property, bringing supplies and correspondence. The thick paper and official Chicago seal made her hands tremble before she even opened it. Mrs. Thompson, I hereby inform you that Theodore Thompson, your legal husband, died of pneumonia in March 1880. As his widow, you are entitled to inheritance as stipulated in his will. The words blurred before her eyes. Theodore was dead. The man who had haunted her nightmares, who had thrown her out of the house with violence, no longer existed. Will found her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter forgotten before her, silent tears rolling down her face. Sarah. He approached cautiously, recognizing the fragility in her posture. What happened? He died, she whispered. Theodore. My first husband. He died. Will sat beside her, not touching but offering presence. How do you feel? Sarah laughed, a broken and strange sound. I don't know. Should I feel relief? Sadness? Guilt for feeling relief? She looked at him with lost eyes. For months I lived in fear that he would find me, that he would come after me. And now you're truly free, Will said gently. Sarah took the letter again, reading the lines about the inheritance. Theodore had left a considerable amount, including the house in Chicago and bank investments. It says here I need to go to Chicago to resolve the legal matters, she murmured. That the inheritance must be claimed personally. The silence stretched between them like a river that had suddenly become too deep to cross. Do you want to go back? Will asked, and there was carefully controlled vulnerability in his voice. Sarah looked out the window, where hope was playing in the garden they had planted together, where the first green corn shoots emerged from the rich earth. This is my home, she said firmly. You are my family, but maybe I need to face that place one last time. Put the ghosts to rest. Will nodded, understanding and concern mixing in his grey eyes. How long would it take? A few weeks, maybe a month, enough to resolve everything, and she paused, an idea beginning to form. Will, what if I sold everything there? The house, the investments. I could use the money to buy more land here, expand our property. His eyes lit up with admiration. You would turn his inheritance into something ours. Into something clean, Sarah agreed. Something we could use to build the future we want for Hope. That night, after Hope had fallen asleep, they sat by the fire, planning. Will knew a lawyer in Helena who could accompany her to Chicago, and Rebecca had offered to care for Hope during Sarah's absence. I'm afraid, Sarah admitted, as she watched the flames dance. Afraid to go back to that place, to relive everything. Will took her hand, kissing her fingers tenderly. You're not the same woman who fled from there, he said. You're stronger now. You're a mother, a landowner, a woman who built a life with her own hands. Sarah nestled against his shoulder, breathing the familiar scent of leather and soap that had become synonymous with safety. When I return, will it be to stay? He asked against her hair. When I return, she said with absolute certainty, it will be home. Outside the wind whispered through the pines, carrying promises of summer and changes. But inside the house, wrapped in the golden light of fire, and the love they had built slowly, brick by brick, Sarah knew that some roots grow so deep that no storm can tear them out. June painted Montana with colors Sarah never thought she would see when she departed for Chicago on a morning wrapped in mist. The farewell had been more difficult than she had imagined. Hope crying in Rebecca's arms, while Will accompanied her to the train station in Copper Falls, both struggling not to show how much this separation, even temporary, tore them apart. The train journey across the infinite plains gave Sarah too much time to think. The landscape slowly changed from Montana's wild vastness to the increasingly larger eastern cities, and with each mile she felt as if she were traveling not just through space, but through time, back to a version of herself she barely recognized. Chicago received her with the deafening noise and smoke she had forgotten existed. The streets teemed with urban life, carriages, shouting vendors, the constant murmur of thousands of people living on top of each other. After Montana's sacred silences, the city seemed almost brutal in its intensity. Theodore's house remained exactly as she had left it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, received her at the door with a mixture of surprise and, Sarah noted with irony, relief. Mrs. Thompson, said the elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly, we didn't know if you would return. Sarah walked through the rooms that had once been her prison, observing how everything seemed smaller now, less imposing. The expensive, heavy furniture, The velvet curtains that blocked natural light, the austere portraits of Thompson ancestors, all of this belonged to a world that was no longer hers. In Theodore's office, where he had worked his long hours, Sarah found piles of meticulously organized documents. The lawyer, Mr. Hutchinson, had explained that Theodore had been even more financially successful after her departure, as if her absence had released an energy he didn't know he possessed. But it was in the bedroom they had shared that Sarah found the most revealing discovery. In a locked drawer of his desk, she found letters, dozens of them, addressed to a woman named Victoria Mason. Love letters, promises of marriage as soon as he got rid of certain domestic complications. Sarah sat heavily on the bed, holding the evidence of Theodore's hypocrisy. He had accused her of infidelity while maintaining a mistress, had questioned her child's paternity while planning a new life with another woman. The anger she felt was clean and purifying, burning the last vestiges of guilt she carried. 3 weeks in Chicago were enough to resolve all legal matters. Sarah sold the house to a young family who saw it with eyes full of dreams. She remembered that feeling. The investments were liquidated, personal possessions donated or sold. The only thing she kept was a photograph of her parents, which Theodore had tried to hide after marriage, and some jewelry that had belonged to her mother. Everything else, the life she had built as Mrs. Theodore Thompson, was erased as if it had never existed. On the morning of her departure, Sarah visited Theodore's grave. It was a simple headstone in Graceland Cemetery, without flowery words or proclamations of eternal love. She knelt on the green grass and placed a single white rose on the marble. "I forgive you," she whispered to the silence, "not for your mistakes but for my own peace." The train that would take her back to Montana waited at the station, whistling impatiently. Sarah climbed the steps without looking back, carrying a small suitcase and a check that represented the closing of a chapter and the opening of infinite possibilities. As Chicago disappeared on the horizon, Sarah placed her hand over her heart and smiled. In a few hours she would be flying across the plains toward the mountains, toward the man who waited for her, toward the child who called her Mama, toward the place that had become her true home. The sun was setting behind the mountains when the train finally arrived at Copper Falls Station, painting the sky in coral and gold tones that Sarah had seen only in her dreams during the long weeks in Chicago. Her eyes eagerly searched the platform, and then she saw him. Will standing beside the wagon, hope in his arms, both watching every train window with expectation. Sarah descended quickly, forgetting all etiquette, running across the platform like a woman possessed by longing. Will saw her first, his entire face lighting up in a smile that could compete with the setting sun. Hope, who had grown perceptibly in just 1 month, extended her little arms toward her with cries of joyful recognition. "Mama came back," Will murmured when Sarah reached them, enveloping them in an embrace that lasted an eternity and still wasn't enough. Sarah kissed Hope's face repeatedly, breathing the sweet, familiar scent of her daughter, before turning to Will. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she had learned about herself and about what really mattered, but words seemed inadequate. "I missed you," she said simply, and Will understood everything she couldn't express. The journey home was punctuated by Hope's animated babbling and Will's constant glances, as if he needed to convince himself that Sarah had really returned. When they finally glimpsed the property, their property, Sarah felt as if she was seeing a miracle. During her absence, Will had been busy. The garden had flourished magnificently, the cabin expansions had been completed, and a new fence surrounded a field where several cows grazed peacefully. "I bought cattle with part of the funds we discussed," Will explained, helping her down from the wagon. "Rebecca suggested we diversify beyond gold mining." Sarah looked around, seeing improvements in every direction. There was a new cistern for rainwater collection, a chicken coop with satisfied cackling hens, and vegetable gardens that promised an abundant harvest. "Will, it's magnificent," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Then there was a lot of time to work," he admitted with a shy smile, "and not much to do besides preparing our house for when you returned." Our house. The words hit her with renewed force. In Chicago, she had remembered what it meant to be alone in the world, how it was to live in a house that never became a home. Here, every corner carried memories of joint construction. Every object had a shared story. That night, after Hope had fallen asleep in her crib, which had also been improved during Sarah's absence, they sat on the expanded porch, watching the stars emerge in Montana's dark sky. "How was it?" Will asked softly. "In Chicago?" Sarah told him everything, about the house that seemed smaller, about the letters that revealed Theodore's true nature, about the feeling of visiting the tomb of a life that had never really been hers. "I brought something for you," she said, taking a small package from her suitcase. Will opened it carefully, revealing a gold pocket watch with an elaborate chain. "It belonged to my father," Sarah explained. "The only thing of real value that Theodore couldn't take from me. I want you to have it." Will turned the watch in his hands, feeling the weight of history and meaning. "Sarah, I can't accept this." "Please," she interrupted. "My father always said a man needs a reliable watch, and that time is the only real gift we can give each other. I want you to have all my moments, Will Mackenzie." He kissed her then, gentle and deep, and Sarah knew she was truly home, not just in the land she owned or the house they had built, but in the arms of the man who had proved that love can grow slowly, built on foundations of respect, affection, and daily choices to remain. "Tomorrow we'll go to the bank in Helena," she said, nestling against his shoulder. "We'll deposit the money and make plans to buy the adjacent lands." "We have time," Will murmured against her hair. "We have all the time in the world." July bloomed in Montana, with an exuberance that seemed to echo the quiet joy that had settled on the Mackenzie property. Sarah had found her rhythm again, like a dancer who rediscovers familiar music after a long absence. Hope, now 6 months old, crawled through the rooms with the determination of a little explorer, always under the watchful eyes of parents who had learned that family is something built consciously, each day. It was during one of those golden mornings that Rebecca arrived with news that would make Sarah's heart race with joy. "James and Martha had the baby," she announced, dismounting from her mare with a radiant smile. "A boy. He was born last night, healthy and with excellent lungs, according to Martha." Sarah dried her hands on her apron, smiling. The reconciliation between Will and his brother had been gradual but real, built on honest conversations and the recognition that family means supporting each other's choices, even when we don't fully understand them. "What did they name him?" Sarah asked. "William James Mackenzie," Rebecca said with a meaningful look, "in honor of the uncle who was right about following the heart." Will, who had entered from the porch upon hearing voices, stopped abruptly. "They named the boy after me?" "James said he learned a lot watching how you built your family," Rebecca explained, "that you taught him that courage sometimes means choosing love over convention." That afternoon they prepared to visit the new nephew. Sarah wore her best dress, a light blue one Will had bought for her in Helena, and dressed Hope in clothes that looked like little rays of sunshine. The Double Creek Ranch looked different now, less like foreign territory and more like extended family. Martha, still pale from childbirth but radiant, received them at the door with the baby in her arms. "Sarah," she said warmly, "how good to see you again. And this must be the famous Hope." Hope, always sociable, smiled broadly at Martha, making everyone laugh. James appeared behind his wife, looking simultaneously exhausted and euphoric, the classic appearance of a newly formed father. "Will," he said, extending his hand to his brother, "thank you for coming. And Sarah, welcome officially to the Mackenzie family." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Mackenzie family. She had struggled so much to belong somewhere, and now she discovered she belonged not just to a place, but to people who had chosen her as much as she had chosen them. Little William James was a perfect creature, with dark hair like the Mackenzies and eyes that promised to turn blue like his mother's. Hope observed the baby with scientific fascination, extending a tiny hand to touch the even smaller face. "She'll be a wonderful big sister," Martha observed. "Big sister?" Sarah asked. Will and Martha exchanged amused glances. "Well," Martha said with a mischievous smile, "James and I were thinking, this ranch is too big for just one family, and with the new baby we could use help. What if you considered moving here? We could divide operations, combine our lands." Sarah looked at Will, seeing the carefully contained hope in his eyes. "What do you think?" he asked. "It would be like coming home in a way." Sarah thought of her little cabin, the place where she had found strength and where hope had been born. It would be hard to leave that first refuge, but looking around, at the family she had gained, at the possibilities that opened before them, she knew that home wasn't a specific place. Home was wherever Will was, wherever they could raise hope together, wherever they could build a future based on love and conscious choices. "I think," she said slowly, smiling, "it would be exactly the kind of new adventure we need." Will kissed her right there, in front of his family, while Hope clapped with her little hands, and baby William James slept peacefully, oblivious to the fact that he was witnessing the moment when a family decided to become even bigger and stronger. September arrived with its golden touch, transforming the aspen leaves into gold coins that danced in the gentle wind. The move to the Double Creek Ranch had been smoother than Sarah expected, like water finding its natural level. The larger house easily accommodated both families, and the division of responsibilities had created a dynamic that benefited everyone. Sarah found herself sitting on the wide porch, watching Hope take her first hesitant steps between her and Will. The girl, now 9 months old, had become a little force of nature, determined to explore every corner of her expanded world. "Come to Mama," Sarah encouraged, extending her arms. Hope considered the distance with the seriousness of an engineer planning a bridge, then took 3 determined steps before letting herself fall into her mother's waiting arms. Will applauded, as if it were the most remarkable achievement in human history. "She has your adventurous spirit," he observed, sitting beside them. "And your stubbornness," Sarah added with a smile. Martha appeared in the doorway, carrying little William James, who had become a chubby and content baby. "James wants to discuss the plans for expanding the herd," she said. "Can you come, Will?" Will kissed Sarah's forehead and the top of Hope's head before following Martha inside. Sarah remained on the porch holding her daughter, watching the mountains that rose majestically on the horizon. It was then that she saw the carriage approaching along the dusty road. It was an elegant vehicle, pulled by 2 well-cared-for horses, clearly not belonging to any of the local neighbors. Sarah felt a stab of apprehension. Unexpected visitors in remote places rarely brought good news. The carriage stopped in front of the house, and a man stepped down, tall, well-dressed, with graying hair and an authoritative bearing. For a moment, Sarah didn't recognize him. Then memory struck her like lightning. Theodore Thompson Sr., her late husband's father. Sarah rose slowly, instinctively pressing Hope against her chest. The elderly man observed her with eyes that were exactly like his son's, cold, calculating, disapproving. "Sarah Catherine," he said, his voice carrying the same arrogance she remembered. "You're a very difficult woman to find." "Mr. Thompson," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I wasn't expecting you." "I imagine not." He climbed the porch steps without invitation. "Especially considering you abandoned my son and are now living in Mersin with another man." Sarah felt her blood freeze, but forced herself to remain calm. "Your son died, Mr. Thompson. I'm very sorry for your loss, but—" "My son died alone and betrayed," he interrupted, his eyes fixing on Hope. "And now we discover that you not only abandoned your home and conjugal duties, but also kidnapped my granddaughter." The world seemed to stop. Sarah looked at Hope, then at the man who was watching her with possessive ownership. "What do you mean?" "The child is a Thompson by blood and legal right," he said coldly. "I've come to take her back to Chicago, where she can be raised properly, away from this deplorable situation." Sarah stepped back, her grip on Hope becoming protective. "You're mistaken. Hope cannot— she cannot be taken. I have here a court order." He produced papers from his coat, "granting me legal custody of the child based on evidence of maternal abandonment and inappropriate environment." Sarah's legs nearly failed. Hope, sensing her mother's tension, began to whimper nervously. "This is my daughter," Sarah said with a trembling voice. "You cannot—" "She is the only part of my son that remains," Thompson Sr. said with finality, "and I will not allow her to be raised by a woman of questionable morality on a savage frontier." It was then that Will appeared in the doorway, alerted by the raised voices. His eyes immediately assessed the situation. Sarah, pale and trembling, a stranger in expensive clothes holding official papers, and Hope crying. "Is there a problem here?" Will asked, his voice calm but charged with dangerous authority. Thompson Sr. looked at him with disdain. "You must be the man who corrupted my daughter-in-law. I am Theodore Thompson Sr., legal grandfather of this child." Sarah looked at Will with desperation in her eyes, and he immediately understood that their family, their new, precious, unlikely family, was under attack. The silence that followed was charged with electric tension, like the air before a devastating storm. Will descended the porch steps slowly, each movement calculated, his eyes never leaving Thompson Sr.'s face. "Let me see those papers," Will said, extending his hand. Thompson Sr. hesitated for a moment, then handed over the documents with an air of superiority. Will read them carefully, his expression becoming increasingly somber. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice controlled but tense, "I need you to take Hope inside and call James." Sarah hesitated, reluctant to leave Will to face this threat alone. "Now, Sarah," Will insisted, and there was something in his tone that made her obey immediately. When she disappeared through the door, Will turned his full attention to Thompson Sr. "These papers are based on false information," he said, returning the documents. "Sarah didn't abandon her child. She fled from a domestic abuse situation to protect herself and the child. The allegations against my son were never proven in court," Thompson Sr. retorted. "And even if they were true, that doesn't change the fact that the child is a Thompson and belongs with family." Will laughed, a humorless sound. "The child belongs with her mother, and her mother is Sarah Mackenzie, my wife." "Your marriage is a sham," Thompson Sr. said with disdain. "A convenience to legitimize a scandalous situation. I have investigators who documented the entire sordid situation." It was then that James appeared, alerted by Sarah about the crisis. Behind him came Martha and Rebecca, forming a united line of support. "What's the problem?" James asked, immediately sensing the tension. "This man is trying to claim custody of Hope," Will explained briefly. James observed Thompson Sr. with the experience of a man who had dealt with many types over the years. "Based on what?" "Based on the fact that I am the child's closest relative and can offer her a proper life," Thompson Sr. said. "Away from this irregular situation." "Irregular situation?" Martha stepped forward, her eyes blazing with indignation. "This family is more decent and loving than many I've known in the city." "With all due respect, ma'am, but you don't understand the legal complexities involved." It was Rebecca who spoke next, her voice calm but firm. "Actually, I understand more than you imagine. My husband is a lawyer in Helena, and I can tell you that those papers you're brandishing have no legal value in Montana." Thompson Sr. looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Rebecca continued, "that a court order from Illinois has no jurisdiction over a child who is legally a resident of Montana and whose mother is married to a respected citizen of this territory." Sarah reappeared in the doorway, having left Hope with one of Martha's employees, her eyes red but determined. "Furthermore," she said, descending the steps, "Hope was officially adopted by my husband when we married. She is legally a Mackenzie, not a Thompson." Thompson Sr. paled slightly. That cannot be correct." "I can show you the papers if you wish," Sarah offered coldly. "They are properly filed at the county office." The elderly man looked around, suddenly finding himself facing not just Sarah, but an entire family united against him. "So you don't understand," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of desperation. "She's all I have left of him, all that remains of Theodore." Sarah felt a stab of compassion despite everything. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "I understand your pain, but Hope is my daughter. I cannot allow you to take her no matter how much you're suffering." "She's not even Theodore's biological daughter," he exploded. "The investigators discovered the truth about your indiscretions. The child is illegitimate." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of shock and gradual understanding. "How did you know?" "The dates don't match," Thompson Sr. said bitterly. "Theodore was traveling on business when the child was conceived for weeks. The child cannot be his." Sarah looked at Will, then at the family that had become her rock. "You're right," she finally said. "Hope is not Theodore's daughter." Thompson Sr. smiled triumphantly. "Then you admit—" "I admit that she is William Mackenzie's daughter," Sarah interrupted, looking directly into Will's eyes. "In every way that matters." Will approached her, taking her hand. "You don't need to lie to protect me," he said softly. "I'm not lying," Sarah replied with a clear voice. "Hope may not have been born from your blood, Will, but she is your daughter, as much as if she were. You were present at every important moment of her life. You're the only father she knows." Thompson Sr. looked between them with confusion and growing frustration. "This doesn't change the legal facts." "Actually, it does," Rebecca said firmly. "If the child is not biologically related to Theodore, you have no legal rights over her. And even if you did, our territorial law protects established families against external claims." Will turned to Thompson Sr. with absolute finality. "My daughter is not going anywhere. This is her family, this is her home, and here she will stay." Thompson Sr. looked around once more, seeing the unwavering determination in every face. Slowly, he put the papers back in his coat. "This is not over," he said, but there was a defeat in his voice he couldn't hide. "Yes," Sarah said softly, "it is over." 1 year later, Sarah sat on the same porch, where she had faced Theodore Thompson Sr., but the world had completely transformed around her. Hope, now a confident child of almost 2 years, ran among the flowers in the garden they had planted together, her laughter echoing through the hills like bell music. The Mackenzie property had prospered beyond all dreams. The combination of James's ranch with Sarah's small gold mine had created a prosperous operation that established them as one of the territory's most respected families. But more important than financial success was the peace that had settled in their lives like golden dust after a storm. Will approached from behind, wrapping her in his arms and resting his hands on her slightly rounded belly. "How do you feel today?" he murmured against her hair. "Happy," Sarah replied simply, covering his hands with hers. "Just incredibly happy." The second Mackenzie baby was expected to arrive in late autumn, and this time Sarah carried no fear or uncertainty. This child would be born in a house full of love, surrounded by family who had chosen to stay united through all storms. Hope ran toward them, her dark hair shining in the sun, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked, enthusiastically pulled from the garden. "For Mama," she declared, offering the slightly crushed flowers. Sarah knelt to receive them, kissing her daughter's rosy face. "They're the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen," she said, and Hope radiated pride. "James is returning from town," Will observed, pointing to the approaching carriage on the road. When James stopped in front of the house, he was smiling broadly and waving a telegram. "News from Helena," he shouted. "Montana has just been accepted as a state. We're no longer a territory. We're officially the state of Montana." Sarah felt tears of joy burning her eyes. There was something deeply symbolic in the fact that her new home was becoming official, at the same time her own life was finding its final form. Martha appeared in the doorway with little William James in her arms, now a sturdy 1-year-old who considered Hope his big sister and followed her every movement. "This means celebration," she declared. "Rebecca is coming to dinner and we're going to toast our new state." That night, as the family gathered around the large table Will had built with his own hands, Sarah looked at the illuminated faces around her and felt such deep gratitude it nearly left her breathless. Rebecca raised her glass of homemade wine. "A toast," she said, "to the state of Montana and to families that grow along with it." "To new beginnings," Martha added. "To the courage to follow the heart," James said, looking meaningfully at Will. Will stood, his own glass in hand, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "To love that is built slowly," he said, "and to families we choose to create." Sarah stood as well, one hand resting on her belly where new life grew, the other holding Hope's small hand. "To home," she said simply. "Wherever it may be, with whomever it may be, home is where we choose to build our life together." They drank, and afterwards Sarah took Hope in her arms and walked to the porch. The stars were emerging in Montana's vastly dark sky, each one seeming like a fulfilled promise. "Look, my dear," she whispered to Hope, pointing to the sky. "All those stars watched us find our way home." Hope extended a tiny hand toward the stars, as if she could touch them, then nestled against Sarah's chest with the absolute confidence of a child who had never doubted she would be loved. Will joined them, enveloping mother and daughter in his strong arms. In the sacred silence of Montana night, with the distant sound of cattle settling and the whisper of wind in the trees, they remained together, a family formed not by blood or convention, but by the daily choices of love, protection, and mutual commitment. Sarah closed her eyes and made a silent prayer of gratitude. She had fled Chicago as a broken woman, carrying only hope and determination. Now she stood on her porch as wife, mother, landowner, matriarch of a family she had chosen to create against all odds. The wind carried the sound of laughter from the house behind them, where the rest of the family still celebrated. Sarah smiled, knowing this would be the memory she would keep forever, this perfect moment of peace when everything finally fell into place exactly where it should be. Some endings are actually beginnings in disguise, and sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in the earth, but in the people we choose to call family.